The One-Eyed Widow of Bukit Ho Swee. The One-Eyed Widow once had a hut near the temple at the summit of Bukit Ho Swee in Singapore. Having lived there for 20 years, she had 5 children and they never had enough to live on, especially since her husband had died 3 years ago. Her eldest son worked in a box factory. He earned $2.60 a day. One daughter worked in an old oil factory, the other in a paper factory. Each earned $1.60 a day. The youngest son went to school in Kampong Ho Swee. One more child stayed at home. On a night last July, their hut was outlined for an instant in a wash of flame, and they ran with a screaming mass of 7,500 people away from the fire. Now they live in a Singapore Improvement Trust flat near Bukit Ho Swee, which is now HDB. It has a red door, grey walls, cream windows, a sitting room, 1 bedroom, a kitchen and a toilet. The cement floor is cold, scrubbed clean and bare. With the $100 that she received in relief aid, she bought a kerosene stove, a meat safe, 4 stools, slippers for everyone in the family, hot pans, porcelain bowls in a square area of linoleum for the bedroom. There's nothing else in the flat. It has the cold emptiness and smell of never having been lived in, as if nobody alive stayed there. In the center of the bedroom, nesting on the bare linoleum, are the only 2 articles saved from the fire. A sewing machine perched on a wooden trunk, standing high and quiet like an altar to a pagan god of destruction. The signs of the One-Eyed Widow saved the trunk. The police recovered the sewing machine and the 4 10-cent coins from the site of the fire. The One-Eyed Widow and her family lived in the flat rent-free for 3 months. Now they have to pay $55 a month for rent. There's only one breadwinner in the family, the son who works in a box factory. The factories in which her daughters have worked no longer exist since they exploded in the fire. The school where the youngest boy went also burned. The old widow had fallen many times as she rushed away from the Holocaust. She is afraid to walk now. She cannot explain it, but she trips and falls all the time.
Felt they'd been let down by people who'd come to collect stories. So in a way she was saying, oh, I don't want to give you a copy, but I'll read it. And I said, oh, can I record it? And I've got a recording somewhere. Perhaps it would be good. Maybe at the launch that we've got in December, I could bring that along and put it on YouTube or something. It's only an audio, but perhaps we can find some nice images for it. But I mean, for that story, it's so short. But for me, it was like a revelation. It was where were we? We were at I can't remember what cafe it is at Brassbusser Road. You know, opposite the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd. That's where SJI originally was. Okay, and that's Gregory Nalpon's original school. So that was kind of opposite in some ways. The rain was coming down, and she was kind of reading that. But it was a revelation as well, because no other story seems to be that I'd come across till that time seemed quite so overt and angry. And I think interesting that the use of the word Holocaust there, when we usually are given a very different narrative of the Bukit Ho Swee fire. I mean, in some ways this is very mediated because what Bukit Ho Swee fire is being talked about here, but when you talk about Holocaust. But I also think it's interesting, there's a lot of maths. If you look, there's a lot of figures and numbers in Nalpon's writing, and I think that's kind of quite interesting as well. Marxism is a dirty word, isn't it, in Singapore to some degree. But I remember my theology teacher once saying, anybody who is interested in the way that a country works, how a government works, the legal structures and so forth, anyone who wants to understand those kind of things is, in a way, a Marxist, okay? And in a way, there is perhaps something quite interesting about how Nalpon's, in a way, making literature, perhaps out of that kind of analysis of, what should we say, the Singaporean situation. There's a story that I won't read at the moment, perhaps it's not appropriate, but if you have a chance when you look at the book to read, I've got it written down here, the name of it, perhaps I got rid of it. What story is it? I've forgotten the name of it now. Yes, what it was, A Man Without Song. If you get a chance to read that, to me that kind of reads like almost like a alternative national narrative through a domestic family story. So I think something quite interesting is happening there. sorry to bore you with my old man anecdotes, but I've just come back from the UK where I actually met up with Jacinta for a wonderful day, and well, a few days in fact, where she very kindly showed me the material, and it made me realise that this is like the tip of the iceberg. There is an awful lot of stuff out there. And some of the things that she was showing me in some ways quite upset me in some ways, because there's another story that I won't read now, but many of you will probably know it, The Rose and the Silver Key. And that story seems so beautiful and nice, and I think, oh, it's such a wonderful Singaporean fairy tale and so forth. But to see the original manuscript of that and so forth is kind of quite interesting. We think that the character Fatima is foul-mouthed in the story here, or at least the suggestion is given. But in the original, you have her talking to 15 sailors who are trying to make a deal with her for the evening, and she says, it's $15 or you can fuck off. Okay, so I thought it was quite interesting, the earthy kind of language that's being used in those kind of stories. That, you know, there's quite, what should we say? If you think there's kind of grit here, I think that there's far more to be kind of discovered. And talking to Kenny a while ago, I think he reminded me of something that I've often wondered whether it would be a kind of good idea, is the idea of perhaps a short biography of Gregory Nalpon. We don't know very much about him, or, you know, he's been undiscovered for so long, but there are people still around who have memories of Gregory Nalpon, and I think he's like William Blake, who is my specialism. The life perhaps is as interesting, if not more interesting, than the writing to some degree, so perhaps there might be space for something like that. Well, how long have we got? Maybe I could just read two more, if you can bear it, just two more, and then perhaps we'll finish. And maybe if people have got any questions, or that they've got something that they want to say, that would be great. Or if somebody wants to come up and read, that would be wonderful. So maybe, I mean, I can't fit in everything. I had this long shopping list, and Cyril was warning me, you can't have all those, you know, it's too long, and he's quite right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read an excerpt of an essay that he wrote, which is called Gentleman of Leisure. I love Gregory Nalpon's essays. You know, in some ways, you know, you love the short stories, but in some way I have an affection for the essay, and it's quite. In Singapore, I don't know, we have much of an essay tradition in the literature. You know, there's not much of that, so it's interesting to read this. When I first read Gentleman of Leisure, and I think in a way you could say Gregory Nalpon himself aspired to be a gentleman of leisure, though he was a family man and he had other responsibilities as well. It's something that he kind of yearned for. When I read this, I was thinking of Charles Dickens. It almost seemed like Sketches by Boz or something, you know, but you know, with a very interesting twist. But I won't read it all, because obviously time is tight, and you know, we're all modern people, aren't we, and listening, and you're standing, and we've all got kind of memories like goldfish, or attention spans like goldfish, so particularly when listening to me, so I won't read loads of this. Okay, right, so I'm just going to read just an excerpt from this, where it's, okay. So, Gentleman of Leisure. So really, when we're talking about a gentleman of leisure, we're talking about someone who's, in other contexts, a hobo, a bum, a tramp, a vagrant, you know, people who can't exist officially in Singapore anymore, because, you know, we have a wonderful system that, you know, gets rid of people like that. But in the 1950s and 1960s, there were people like this, guys who were drinking and wandering the streets and living, yeah, a tramp's life, a bum's life perhaps, a hobo's life. Okay, so in the essay he talks about how do people become these gentlemen of leisure. Okay, it starts off in school. A rebellious boy argues with a teacher and decides to leave, or sometimes goes right through school, often tasting the sweet feelings of unbounded frustration. The boy, out of school, has never thought of a career, and now his parents insist that he get a job. Anyway, he looks up the situations vacant ads in the newspapers, half-heartedly posts an application, and is surprised when he's accepted. It's not that surprising actually, because this kind of person has qualities of courage and intelligence above the average. Well, after a few months of being pushed around, he chucks the whole thing up or is dismissed, swearing that he'll never work again. He goes out into the streets, having learnt to look up to no man as a superior, or to treat anyone as a subordinate. Now, as he moves freely, undisciplined, and even without a home, because parents seldom tolerate this kind of behaviour, he is not yet a gentleman. Now is the time to prove that he can withstand the shrivelling, stabbing pain of hunger, to go without the cigarette his nerves scream for, to make good friends and keep them. Now is the time when, as his bones harden to the feel of bare stone or sand at nights, he learns to respect age and wisdom in any man, and slowly he rises up in the world that he now views with a most impartial air. He has very good friends who need someone to help them in their little shops or fishing boats, and for a little while each day he helps them. After all, a favour done to someone cannot be considered as bribery, even if he makes a little money, or better still, cigarettes and something to eat. Maybe even a large fresh fish. After all, there's nothing tastier than a hot fried fish dripping in its own sea juices, especially as the air at night turns cold around the harbour. From this time on, there are no more problems in the life of a gentleman. Every day that dawns is the beginning of a new happy life to live, to use and to shape to one's own satisfaction. His circle of friends ranges as wide as the world. He is no longer being pressed in the tight noose of dissatisfaction and worry over promotion, position, hypocrisy and forced friendship for business reasons. This business of friendship can also be embarrassing sometimes, even to a gentleman of leisure. I remember one day when a showy character who disliked the police on a matter of principle met a gentleman. "You come with me to Katong, man, and we'll have a good beer." Sorry about my bad Singapore accent. The showy fellow said, "What's wrong with the beer in town?" The gentleman said, "Oh, I've got a small trouble in Katong. You can help me settle it, and I give you a beer." So the gentleman went to Katong to help the friend. He had a beer, and half an hour later, the small matter that his friend had come to settle came up in the form of 11 gangsters armed with parangs and bottles and sticks, which goes to prove that even a gentleman has to be wary about his friends sometimes. And it was quite interesting while I was in Cambridge looking through these documents, manuscripts with Jacinta. There was a list, in these notebooks there were not only writings but lists that Naupon had made, and one list was of assets, and in that list was mentioned one parang, which is kind of quite interesting in the context of that story, why he would have a parang. I'm sure it's quite innocent and so forth, but it does remind me, if you've ever seen the Singapore film Perth, I don't know if you've seen that, the Geylang massacre, when the taxi driver opens the boot of the car and says parang, because one never knows. Have we got time just for one more? Yeah, okay. I think it's heartbreaking in many ways that me, some Angmo professor, is reading these, and Gregory Naupon himself is not reading these. So I wanted to finish perhaps with something that almost sounds to me as if it's, Gregory Naupon speaking directly to us. In the magazine Her World, strangely enough, I find it quite strange that Gregory Naupon published so much in Her World. I don't know, Cyril, you'd ever think of publishing there, or have, but you have, okay, so interesting confession. So several stories were published in the mid-70s by Gregory Naupon in Her World, and he also wrote an essay towards the end of his life, and I just want to read a bit from that, just to finish. And perhaps I'll just read the end, because in some ways I'd like to read the first bit, or I'd urge you to read the first bit, because it's very interesting, and because there's a very direct and very moving appeal to Gregory Naupon's daughter Jacinta. I mean, in many ways, I'm meant to be an academic and so forth, but this story kind of moves me the more I find out about it. Gregory Naupon died at the age of 40 suddenly, and he left a family emotionally and financially bereft, and in a way perhaps it's taken them a very long time to kind of recover from that kind of situation. And in this, I think it's very poignant that Jacinta was given by her father 2 kind of letters, or kind of creative works that Gregory Naupon wrote for his daughter at her birth, and also on her 14th birthday, and obviously she's treasured them, and they are quoted here. Perhaps I'll just read the bit that's written for Jacinta here, okay? "Well, Jacinta, little flower of my heart, it is necessary to remember that you must always be free to preserve all the rules, or break them if you have to. Feel as exhilaratingly free as the pup I saw this morning, racing crazily over the seashore, lime-sweet spray and the early sun matted on his coat. Do not forget that life is a story told by God to each one of us. Only a story that we personally see and feel, sad and happy stories of pain and courage and sacrifice. of bitterness and despair, joy and love. Stories we actually live through with God as the master storyteller, imparting a different take to every single one of us, with birth as its beginning and what we call death as its end. And we are free to bear the story out or run away like bored and restless little children. Of course, those who run away discover it is impossible to find their way back to the lap of God when the story has been told. So Jacinta, use your freedom wisely. There's also a nice little bit where he recalls how Jacinta laughed as a little girl. I think she was like 11 or 12, but her father was showing her how to ride a bike and he fell off. And Jacinta laughed and her dad smacked her bottom. And he's saying, you know, I taught, in a way he's showing he's a kind of strict pater familias, but he's also saying, you know, in a way perhaps I'm a pompous ass to some degree. And he's also kind of poking fun at himself as well as other people. But I also wanted to talk about Gregory Nalpon's other child, Zero, who is now quite a prominent lawyer in Singapore. It's quite a distinctive name that he's called Zero. And here Gregory Nalpon explains why he's called Zero. According to this essay, it almost caused a divorce, that Gregory Nalpon's wife, Mona, almost divorced him because he insisted or cunningly got his child kind of legally named Zero. And Zero does seem quite a weird name, but this explains it perhaps. The affair of the near divorce was precipitated by my son Zero. Yes, Zero. If we had another girl, she would by common consent have been called Francesca Bella. But I was quite clear in my mind that a boy would be nothing other than Zero. Think of it, he can never be less than Zero. His is a natural platform for achievement. Every mark scored in school, every act in his life cannot but be a logical advancement. And if his first initial appears on his test paper as well, he does not own the copyright to it, does he? At the baptismal font, however, the godparents begged to decline the signal honour and I bestowed upon them. The priest, upon learning of the infant's intended name, did a most unpriestly thing. He called me aside and in a very grave whisper threatened to assault me. And so the son was christened Geraldo Mario, and there was a sound like leaves soughing in the breeze. It was a concerted sigh from those assembled in church. There was much merriment and relief after the baptism, and the wine gurgled sweetly down many throats. But there were some in the house who looked disconcertedly at my happiness. It was generally postulated that I had overcome the folly of my thoughts, that I had forgotten the magic name Zero. Where's my water? Sorry. One last time. But I had learnt how to play poker during quiet nights in Sarawak, and I'm sure he did. He spent a lot of time in Sarawak. And my teachers were masters of the art. I still held the trump card, and my son's birth had yet to be registered. So on the very last day permissible, I presented myself at the registry of births, and with deep pride and dignity announced my son's name, Zero Geraldo Mario Nalpon. I will never forget the fineness, the solemnity of that moment. I had named my son. Many friends who doubted my courage in naming my son threw a small feast in repayment of a wager. And Gregory Nalpon, as well as being a great writer, I think was quite interested in a little gambling and a little card playing. The courage that they failed to recognise was to surface in that moment of truth when I delivered the mint new birth certificate into my wife's keeping. She was too busy consulting her lawyer to notice the exhibition of my courage. Neither did I, for that matter. Well, Zero is getting along fine in school. He's had his share of fights to stamp out ridicule, and in art class he signs his name proudly, Zero. He's a good student and a good scout. He loves adventure as much as I do. The hikes and the camping, the fishing and a bit of shooting, well-watered whiskey to keep out the chill at night, and an appreciation of feminine charms. He can safely aspire to be a smuggler or just a contented bum if he succeeds in traversing the age of puberty. So very good Singaporean ambitions for children. I have given Jacinta her sermon and Zero his name. I am content in the knowledge that I have done my duty. I too must now rest. Okay, so thank you very much.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
I'm Robin from the press for
yes.
the National Critics' Choice. The question is that what's the inspiration behind the title "The Wayang at 8 Milestone"?
Oh, right. That's a kind of so why this volume is called this?
Yes.
You're asking. I'll try and give a short answer, which is very difficult for me over these kind of things. Well, to me, I must confess, it wasn't my choice. It was something that the publisher came up with, and behind the scenes, perhaps there were a few tussles with the publishers. But on this point, I thought it was a stroke of genius that they chose this name, because in a way, I think it's a double whammy. It really kind of evokes old Singapore, forgotten Singapore in two ways. I mean, Wayang, there used to be Malay Wayang, didn't there? It's a Malay word, and it's kind of been marginalised. Even Chinese Wayang seems to be less and less happening in Singapore. But also 8 Milestone. I'm sure some of us know what's meant by 8 Milestone. I see younger faces amongst us, not quite so sure, but there were these kind of milestones, weren't there? From the centre of Singapore, you have one milestone, and I think it lives on in some of the names that we find in Singapore. So in a way, I thought that was great. But behind that lies the fact that we did do a little bit of editing. Oh, I'm going to reveal some secrets here, and if this is ever put on YouTube or whatever, perhaps this wasn't the wisest idea. Maybe we can edit this out and I'll just secretly tell you this. But one story in here that we put in, which is called The Courtship of Donatello Vargo, I think that's right, the title, was originally published in one of Robert Yeo's story collections as A Girl as Sweet as Alice, and I've yet to find out from Robert Yeo if he actually edited this story down from its original into A Girl as Sweet as Alice, or something else had happened. But in some ways, we are guilty in some ways of doing a little bit of editing as well. So the story, The Wayang at 8 Milestone, we loved the title, but it belonged to a very small and slight sketch that Nalpon had written. But it grew into a story called An Eye for an Eye, and so we decided to swap the title round and add bits of the sketch, which seemed to be very nice, into the story and so forth. But perhaps we felt kind of justified in some ways in doing that, because both of them fused together. I think Jason Lundberg kind of helped with this and assisted with his own kind of skills. It was almost like weaving a tapestry or putting these two kind of fragments together. So,
do you have any regrets, or do you have any conclusions on how this book will end?
how it is at the moment?
Yes. Would you ever add in more stories, or?
Well, my hope is that we'll have a second volume. I mean, in a way, this is a work in progress. This is where we are at the moment. But I'm hoping maybe, if there is interest and so forth, maybe we could do a slightly more scholarly work. I mean, one thing that I found really interesting in Cambridge was to find one of the Gregory Nalpon's notebooks, and it was like covered from page to page. It's fascinating, and it worked this way, that on this side, he was writing his notes all the way through, and then he went backwards. I hope I'm making myself clear, but then he started again at the back on this side and wrote all the way through. So, I mean, in a way, it would be wonderful. I'm sure it's going to be impossible, but to do a facsimile of that notebook would be kind of wonderful. But to have some of this material in a second volume would be nice if it's possible. Yeah.
Now, having stayed here in Singapore, what does Singapore mean to you today?
I don't think you should ask. I'm not very good at answering that kind of politically, perhaps, or in a kind of a politic way. Well, the sun's shining. I think that's very nice and so forth.
No, but as a poet. But as a poet.
Well, I'm not a poet.
Oh.
But that's my loss in some way. I'm a mere scholar and so forth. But I'm always moaning about Singapore. But I don't think I'd like to be anywhere else.